Khaled, a powerful CEO haunted by family tragedy, enters a marriage contract with Lea, a humble woman desperate to save her ailing mother. What begins as a cold, calculated arrangement turns into a game of control and appearances. But as buried secrets surface and emotions begin to break through their carefully maintained walls, their fragile deal takes an unexpected turn. With twins on the way and a family legacy at stake, Khaled and Lea must confront the fine line between duty and desire. Will their arrangement collapse under the weight of their growing feelings, or will love prove stronger than any contract? Khaled Al-Fahim, seated behind a mahogany desk on the 40th floor of his towering building, exuded authority. His piercing gaze rested on the young woman before him. Lea Morrison, her hands folded tightly in her lap, betrayed only the faintest hint of unease, despite her composed exterior. "So, Miss Morrison," Khaled's voice, deep and deliberate, broke the silence. "Do you understand what I am proposing?" Lea glanced toward the sprawling cityscape outside the office windows. The golden hues of the sunset reflected off the skyscrapers, a stark contrast to the weight of the moment. "You're offering me a marriage contract," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "An arrangement that benefits us both." Khaled stood, his Italian suit complementing his commanding presence as he moved toward the window. "This is far more than a contract," he said, his words deliberate. "I'm offering stability, security, and a guaranteed future for your family." Leah's heart clenched at the thought of her mother in a hospital bed, fighting a relentless battle against cancer. Their family's savings were gone, the medical bills overwhelming. She couldn't contain her question. "Why me? You could choose anyone." Khaled turned, his expression unreadable. "Because you understand that this is business, not a fantasy. Your education and composure make you suitable for the role, and unlike others, you have a genuine reason to accept." Lea swallowed the bitter truth of his words. Her family needed this. Her mother's life depended on it. "And what do you gain from this, Mr. Al-Fahim?" His lips curved into a barely perceptible smile. "Legitimacy. A respectable marriage will silence doubts about my readiness to take over as chairman of the board." Lea rose, her voice laced with defiance. "So, a business deal disguised as a marriage?" "Precisely." Khaled returned to his desk and opened a leather portfolio, sliding a contract toward her. "The terms are clear. Your mother's treatment and family expenses will be covered. After 5 years, the marriage will be dissolved, and you will receive a significant pension." Leah's fingers trembled as she skimmed the contract. Each clause seemed to tether her future. "And if I fall in love with someone else during this time?" Khaled's gaze hardened. "Then keep it to yourself. Infidelity voids all benefits." She met his eyes, challenging him. "And you? Must you remain faithful too?" "Of course. Mutual respect and discretion are essential," he replied, his tone unwavering. Lea hesitated, thinking of her mother's hopeful face and her younger brother's dreams of college. The weight of her decision pressed down on her. "I accept," she said firmly, "but with one condition: never try to control my heart." For a fleeting moment, something flickered in Khaled's eyes. Admiration, perhaps. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Your feelings are irrelevant to this arrangement. As long as you maintain appearances, what happens in your heart is of no concern to me." She signed the papers, sealing her fate. Khaled's voice remained neutral as he collected the documents. "Welcome to the Al-Fahim family. My assistant will handle the wedding details." Lea stood, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Mr. Al-Fahim. Or should I call you Khaled?" "Khaled is fine, given the circumstances," he replied, escorting her to the door. Before she left, he added, "This will work better if we keep our expectations realistic. We're not characters in a romance novel. Remember that." Lea forced a smile. "Don't worry, Khaled. My heart is perfectly safe from you." As the elevator descended, a single tear escaped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, steeling herself. This was her choice, and she would live with it. At least her family had a chance now. That was enough. Or, so she told herself. The day of the wedding arrived, and Lea stood in her bridal suite, adjusting the dress that fit her perfectly, yet felt foreign. 3 weeks of intense preparation had passed since she signed the contract. Her mother, seated in a wheelchair nearby, looked stronger, the new treatment already showing promise. "You look beautiful, honey," her mother said, her voice weak but filled with pride. Lea turned to her, concern etched on her face. "Mom, you should be resting." "And miss my daughter's wedding?" "Never." Her mother grasped Leah's hand. "Are you sure about this?" Lea swallowed hard, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Yes, you're getting better, and Daniel can stay in college." "And you? What about your happiness?" her mother pressed. "I'll be happy knowing you're okay," Lea replied softly. "And Khaled, he's not a monster." Khaled wasn't cruel, just distant. Their interactions had been polite and businesslike. He was everything she never wanted in a partner, yet he was the solution to her family's impossible situation. A knock interrupted her thoughts. "5 minutes, Miss Morrison," came a voice from outside. Lea helped her mother to her seat in the ballroom, where her younger brother Daniel waited. His gratitude and concern were evident as he embraced her. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Lea said with a faint smile. "Take care of Mom." Alone in the hallway, she took a deep breath, bracing herself for the ceremony. As the music began, she walked toward Khaled, who waited at the altar, a picture of composure in his tailored suit. The ceremony was elegant and brief, their vows formal and devoid of emotion. When Khaled leaned in to kiss her, it was a mere brush of lips, calculated and cold. At the reception, Lea played her role flawlessly, smiling and engaging with the guests under Khaled's watchful gaze. During their first dance, he surprised her by speaking softly. "You're an excellent actress." Years of corporate sales had prepared her for this, but she replied, "It's more than that. I have a reason to make this work." Khaled's eyes flickered with something. Amusement, perhaps. "I never fully trust anyone, Lea. It's how I've survived." "What a lonely existence," she said, before she could stop herself. His hand tightened slightly on her waist. "Loneliness is preferable to vulnerability." Before she could respond, the music ended and he guided her back to their table. The evening passed in a blur of formalities, but as Lea lay awake that night, she vowed to hold on to a part of herself, the part that still believed in love, even if her new husband never would. The evening progressed as expected, marked by polite conversations, formalities, and unspoken tension. The brief moment of near intimacy between Lea and Khaled had dissipated, leaving her both intrigued and unsettled. When it was finally time to leave, Lea hugged her family tightly, her mother crying softly, while her younger brother Daniel struggled to hold back tears. Lea, however, maintained her composure through sheer willpower. The limousine ride to the airport was enveloped in silence. Their destination, Khaled's private villa in the Hamptons, a strategic choice for their honeymoon to maintain privacy, while carefully crafting their public image as a couple. As the city lights blurred past, Khaled's thoughtful gaze lingered on Lea. "Something on your mind?" Lea asked, breaking the silence. "You surprised me today," Khaled admitted. "Your composure with the board members, the way you handled my aunt's pointed questions about children, you're more capable than I anticipated." Lea allowed a faint smile. "I'm full of surprises, Mr. Al-Fahim. Perhaps you should have done more thorough research before proposing this arrangement." A ghost of a smile flickered across his lips. "Perhaps. Though I suspect no amount of research could have prepared me for the reality of you." His words hung in the air, weighted with implications they both avoided exploring. Lea turned her attention to the night sky beyond the window, wondering what other surprises awaited in the life they were building. When they arrived at the villa, Khaled's staff had already prepared separate bedrooms. He escorted her to hers with his usual courteous efficiency, maintaining the professional distance that defined their relationship. "Good night, Lea," he said, pausing at her door. "You performed admirably today. Your family should be proud." "Good night, Khaled," Lea replied, her hand resting on the doorknob. "And thank you for keeping your word about everything." He nodded once before turning away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Lea stepped into her room and sank onto the edge of the bed, finally letting her carefully maintained facade crumble. She was now Mrs. Khaled al-Fahim, a title that would save her family but strip her of the freedom to love on her own terms. As she prepared for bed, the weight of the rings on her finger, the symbols of duty, not love, felt overwhelming. Outside her window, the steady rhythm of crashing waves mirrored her husband's demeanor, constant, powerful, and ultimately unreachable. Lea closed her eyes, steeling herself for a life of privilege and duty, one devoid of the love she had always dreamed of. Yet, unbeknownst to her, fate had plans that would test the walls around both their hearts. The morning sun flooded the villa's open spaces as Lea wandered into the kitchen, surprised to find Khaled already there. He was casually dressed in dark slacks and a white button-down shirt, sipping coffee and scrolling through his tablet. "Good morning," he said, without looking up. "There's fresh coffee in the pot. The housekeeper left breakfast in the warming drawer." Lea poured herself a cup, grateful she had thrown on a silk robe over her pajamas. "I didn't expect you to be here. Don't you have an empire to run?" "The empire can survive without me for a few days," he replied, his tone as neutral as ever. "Besides, we need to establish certain routines. The media will be watching us closely when we return to the city." Everything in their lives was choreographed, even their morning coffee. Lea added cream and sugar, feeling Khaled's gaze on her as she moved. "Your mother's first treatment session is tomorrow," Khaled said, his voice carefully measured. "I've arranged for a car to take you to the hospital, unless you'd prefer to drive yourself." Lea turned, caught off guard by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. A driver would be helpful. I'm not sure how Mom will feel after the treatment." He nodded and returned to his tablet. "I've also arranged for your belongings to be moved from your apartment. The movers will deliver everything to the penthouse tomorrow." "The penthouse?" Lea asked, raising an eyebrow. "I thought we'd be staying here." "This is a vacation home," Khaled explained, as if to a child. "Our primary residence will be the penthouse in Manhattan. It's more convenient for both our schedules. And it's what people expect." "What people expect?" Lea repeated, the phrase grating on her. It seemed to define every aspect of her new life. She sipped her coffee, studying Khaled's unreadable expression. Despite his casual attire, his aura of control remained intact. "And what do you expect, Khaled?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His gaze sharpened, surprise flashing across his face before his mask returned. "I expect you to fulfill your part of the agreement. Nothing more, nothing less." "That's not what I meant." Lea leaned forward, emboldened. "What do you expect from life? From yourself? There must be something you want beyond board approval and appearances." For a moment, genuine surprise softened Khaled's features, but it quickly gave way to cold detachment. "What I want is irrelevant. We all have roles to play. Personal desires are luxuries I cannot afford." "That sounded rehearsed," Lea observed. "How long have you been telling yourself that?" Khaled stood abruptly, his movements betraying a rare moment of discomfort. "I have calls to make. Be ready to leave for the city tomorrow morning at 8. He strode out of the kitchen, leaving Lea alone with her thoughts. The lingering scent of his cologne was a reminder of the walls he had built around himself. For the first time, she wondered if those walls might ever crack, and what it would mean if they did. Later that afternoon, Lea wandered the beach behind the villa, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand. The salty ocean breeze carried a sense of freedom that stood in stark contrast to the gilded cage she had entered. "Mrs. Al-Fahim," a voice called behind her. Thomas, Khaled's personal assistant, approached with a tablet in hand. "Mr. Al-Fahim asked me to review your schedule for the coming week." Lea suppressed a sigh. Even her free time was scheduled now. Of course, Thomas. Let's hear it. As Thomas listed her commitments, Lea noticed movement on the villa's upper balcony. Khaled stood there, watching her. For once, his expression was unguarded, and she glimpsed a hint of the burdens he carried. "Thomas," Lea interrupted, "how long have you worked for Khaled?" The assistant hesitated, caught off guard by the personal question. 8 years, ma'am." "Has he always been so controlled?" Thomas faltered, loyalty warring with something else. "Mr. Al-Fahim has always been extremely dedicated to his responsibilities." "That's not what I asked." Thomas glanced toward the balcony, where Khaled had disappeared. "There was a time, before his brother's accident, when he was different." Leah's heart skipped a beat. "His brother?" Thomas quickly shook his head. "I shouldn't have mentioned it. Shall we continue?" But Lea barely heard the rest. Her mind raced with this new piece of information. A missing brother, a hidden tragedy. The revelation added a new layer to the enigmatic man she had married. That evening, they shared a quiet dinner on the terrace. The sound of waves filled the silence between them as Lea watched Khaled's every precise, controlled movement. Finally, she asked, "Your brother, what was his name?" Khaled's knife paused for the briefest moment. Then, with careful deliberation, he continued eating. "Adrian," he said, his voice barely audible. "His name was Adrian." He set down his utensils with precision. "This is not a topic for discussion, Lea. Ever. The pain in his voice was raw, genuine, the first real emotion she had heard from him. Lea reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of his hand. Sometimes, sharing the burden makes it lighter. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, his mask slipped entirely. She saw years of grief, guilt, and loneliness etched into his face. Then, as quickly as it had dropped, the mask returned. "The burden is mine to carry," he said firmly, rising from the table. "Good night, Lea." She watched him walk away, his shoulders stiff with tension. For the first time, she saw beyond the calculated businessman to the wounded man beneath. The revelation left her shaken, challenging her resolve to keep her heart uninvolved. Rebecca greeted Lea with her usual efficient professionalism as Lea adjusted her dress in the expansive penthouse bedroom. "Has Khaled already left?" she asked. "Mr. Al-Fahim left for the office at 5 this morning," Rebecca replied. "He asked me to remind you about tonight's dinner at Le Berard." Lea nodded. Of course, he had. Their first public appearance as a married couple in Manhattan had to be flawless. Lea smoothed the fabric over her hips and checked her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was polished and poised, every inch the corporate wife she was expected to be. The drive to the hospital blurred into a mix of traffic and nervous anticipation. When Lea entered her mother's hospital room, she found her mother, Claw, sitting up in bed, looking stronger than she had in months. "Look at you," Claw said, smiling as she reached for her daughter's hand, all dressed up like a real socialite. "Mom," Lea murmured, leaning down to hug her gently, careful of the IV lines. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I have in ages," Claw replied, her eyes welling with tears. "This new treatment, it feels like a miracle. I can't believe we're finally here." Lea squeezed her mother's hand, pushing down the guilt that threatened to surface. "The doctors are optimistic," she said. "Dr. Patterson says your numbers are already improving." Her mother's smile softened. "Thanks to your husband," she said, studying Leah's face. "How are things with Khaled, really?" Lea hesitated, unsure how to answer. But before she could respond, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Dr. Patterson. The next hour was filled with medical discussions and cautious optimism. Lea took notes and asked questions, knowing it was what Khaled would expect. It wasn't until she was back in the car, heading toward the restaurant for dinner with Khaled's board members, that her mother's question replayed in her mind. How were things with Khaled? Since the conversation about his brother, Khaled had grown even more distant. Their interactions were brief, centered solely on schedules and appearances. The private dining room at Le Birard buzzed with muted conversation when Lea arrived. She spotted Khaled immediately, standing among a group of older men in tailored suits. His eyes met hers across the room, and with practiced precision, he extended his hand. "Darling," he said smoothly, pulling her to his side. "How is Claude doing?" "The doctors are very positive," Lea replied, allowing him to guide her through introductions to the board members and their wives. His hand remained at the small of her back, a possessive, calculated gesture to reinforce their charade. Mrs. Al-Fahim, one of the older board members, Richard Maxwell, addressed her. "We were just discussing the upcoming charity gala. I trust you'll be taking the lead on that, as is traditional for the CEO's wife." Lea felt Khaled tense slightly beside her. This was an expectation they hadn't discussed. "Actually," she began, but Khaled interrupted smoothly. "Leah's primary focus right now is her mother's recovery. However, I'm sure she'd be happy to consult with the event planning team." "Nonsense," Richard's wife Barbara interjected. "The gala has always been the CEO's wife's responsibility. It's tradition." Lea felt the weight of the unspoken test. Her response would determine her acceptance into their world. "I would be honored to chair the gala committee," she said with a calm smile. Then, glancing at Barbara, she added, "Perhaps you'd be willing to share your expertise from previous years?" Barbara beamed at the suggestion, and Lea noticed approving nods from several board members. She had passed their test, but the subtle pressure from Khaled's hand on her back told her this was not the end of the conversation. Throughout dinner, Lea played her role flawlessly, navigating the social dynamics with precision. She laughed at the right moments, deflected intrusive questions with ease, and charmed even Richard Maxwell, whose approval was notoriously difficult to earn. Yet, she couldn't shake the sensation of Khaled's watchful gaze. His dark eyes remained unreadable, observing her every move. The car ride back to the penthouse was silent until they entered the private elevator. As the doors closed, Khaled turned to her. "You shouldn't have agreed to chair the gala," he said. Lea slipped off her heels, flexing her feet. "I didn't have much choice. You heard Barbara? It's tradition." "Traditions can be changed," he replied, his tone clipped. "You already have enough to handle with your mother's treatment and adjusting to this arrangement." Lea studied him, noticing the faint crease in his brow. "Are you worried I'll embarrass you?" "No," he answered quickly, surprising them both. "I'm worried you're taking on too much." "To maintain appearances?" Lea said, her voice sharp. "Isn't that exactly what you brought me here to do?" Khaled's expression hardened. "I didn't bring you here. We made an arrangement." "An arrangement that requires me to play the perfect wife," she countered. "That includes chairing galas and smiling at board members' wives who critique everything from my shoes to my table manners." "You did more than smile tonight," he said, following her into the living room. "You charmed every person in that room, even Richard Maxwell. He hasn't approved of anything in 20 years. Lea turned to face him, surprised by the faint note of admiration in his voice. "Would you rather I hadn't?" "I'd rather you didn't exhaust yourself trying to exceed expectations that don't matter." "They matter to you," Lea shot back. "Everything about appearances matters to you." Khaled stepped closer, his dark eyes searching hers. "What matters to me is maintaining our arrangement without complications. Taking on the gala creates unnecessary pressure." "Is that concern I hear, Mr. Al-Fahim?" Lea tilted her head, a hint of challenge in her tone. "Professional courtesy," he replied, though his voice faltered for a moment. "Nothing more." "Of course," Lea murmured. "Heaven forbid you actually care about your fake wife's well-being." Something flickered across Khaled's expression. Frustration, perhaps, or something deeper. He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek in a rare moment of tenderness. "You're not fake, Lea," he said softly. "That's what worries me." Before she could respond, he withdrew his hand, his walls snapping back into place. "Good night. I have an early meeting tomorrow." Lea watched him walk away, her cheek tingling where he had touched her. For the briefest moment, she had seen the man behind the mask, and it unsettled her. Later, as she lay in her luxurious bedroom, Lea realized the real danger wasn't in meeting expectations or juggling responsibilities. It was in those fleeting moments when the line between performance and reality blurred. Because, despite her promises to herself, she was beginning to wonder if her heart was as safe as she had believed. Lea sat in the quiet of the study, her laptop open as she searched through old articles about Al-Fahim Industries and the Richardson family, trying to unravel the tension surrounding Khaled's reaction to their name. After 2 hours of scrolling through buried news clippings, she found it, a small article from 12 years ago in the Society pages. The headline read, "Rising star Adrian Al-Fahim engaged to Richardson heiress." The accompanying photo showed a younger Khaled standing beside a man who was unmistakably his brother, Adrian, alongside a striking blonde woman identified as Catherine Richardson. They all looked carefree, their faces untouched by the shadows of tragedy. Leah's heart sank as she clicked on another link. 3 months later, another headline followed. Tragedy strikes Al-Fahim family. Young heir dies in boating accident. The article was brief, mentioning that Adrian had drowned during a weekend trip to the Richardson family's lake house. "Find anything interesting?" Khaled's voice startled her. She turned to find him leaning against the doorway, his tie loosened, his jacket discarded, a rare glimpse of vulnerability behind his polished exterior. "I'm sorry," she began, but he waved off her apology and stepped into the room. "Don't be," he said, pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. "You were bound to discover it eventually, though I didn't expect you to be quite so thorough in your investigation." "The Richardsons," Lea said carefully, watching his expression. "They were going to be your family." Khaled's grip on the glass tightened briefly. Catherine was Adrian's fiancée. They were supposed to be married in the spring. "What happened?" she asked gently. Khaled stared into his drink. "The official story is that Adrian had too much to drink and took the boat out alone at night. But the unofficial story is different. They argued, he and Catherine. She claimed he was acting erratically, accusing her father of shady business practices. And you don't believe it was an accident," Lea said quietly. Khaled let out a bitter laugh. Adrian was an Olympic-level swimmer. He never drank when he was near water. It was a rule he lived by. 2 weeks before his death, he told me he'd discovered something about Richardson Industries. Something big enough to destroy them. "Did you investigate?" "For 3 years," Khaled said, setting the glass down with precise care. "Every lead ended in a dead end. Every witness changed their story. Eventually, my father ordered me to stop, said it was bad for business, that maintaining relationships mattered more." Lea stood, moving closer. "Is that why you've become so focused on control, on maintaining appearances?" His eyes met hers, dark with pain. "I learned that in our world, appearances matter more than truth. Power comes from controlling the narrative." "And emotions make you vulnerable," she said softly, beginning to understand. "Yes," he admitted, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was gentle, at odds with his next words. "Which is why this, whatever is happening between us, needs to stop." Lea caught his hand before he could pull away. "What if I don't want it to stop?" For a moment, his mask slipped completely. She saw longing in his eyes, fear, hope, and something deeper. But then he pulled back, his expression hardening again. "What we want doesn't matter," he said firmly. "We have an arrangement. Anything more would be complicated." "Life is complicated," Lea countered. "Pretending not to feel doesn't make the feelings go away." "No," he agreed, walking toward the door, "but it keeps them from destroying everything we've built." After he left, Lea stared at the open article on her laptop. The photo of Adrian and Khaled smiled back at her. Two brothers unaware of the tragedy ahead. Now she understood why Khaled had buried himself in control and obligation. He hadn't just lost his brother, He had lost his faith in love, in vulnerability, in happiness that couldn't be taken away. The question was whether Lea could reach the man beneath the walls, and whether she was willing to risk her own heart in the process. That night, as Lea got ready for bed, her phone buzzed with a text from Khaled. "I've reconsidered. Add the Richardsons to the guest list. Some ghosts need to be faced." She stared at the message, understanding the cost of his decision. Whatever happened next would change everything, for both of them. The Great Hall of the Metropolitan Museum buzzed with activity as event planners and decorators transformed the space for the upcoming gala. Lea stood at the center of the chaos, reviewing seating arrangements with Barbara Maxwell, even as a tension headache began to build. "The Richardsons must be seated at table 1, Barbara insisted, tapping the chart with a perfectly manicured nail. "They're major donors, and Catherine's father chairs the hospital board." "I understand," Lea replied diplomatically, but Khaled specifically requested they be seated at table 3, with the hospital administrators. Barbara's eyes narrowed. "There's history there, isn't there, between Khaled and Catherine?" Before Lea could respond, Khaled's voice cut through the noise. "The seating arrangements stay as they are." He approached, immaculate in a charcoal suit despite the early hour. His presence immediately commanded attention, the room quieting as staff and planners straightened unconsciously. "Barbara," Khaled said with a smooth smile, "thank you for your input. If you'll excuse us, I need to discuss something with my wife." He guided Lea away from the group, his hand warm at the small of her back despite the professional distance he maintained. "You didn't have to rescue me," Lea murmured once they were out of earshot. "I wasn't rescuing you," he replied quietly. "I was preventing Barbara from gossiping about Adrian. She's been trying to uncover that story for years." Lea studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "Are you sure about having the Richardsons here? We could find another major donor." "It's time," he said firmly. "Besides, your mother's treatment results prove the research program works. We need their continued support." The mention of her mother brought a small smile to Leah's face. The latest scan showed even more improvement. "Dr. Morrison thinks—" Before she could finish, Khaled suddenly pulled her behind one of the museum's massive columns, shielding her from view. Voices approached. "I still think this is a mistake, Catherine," an older woman said. "After what happened with Adrian?" "It's been 12 years, Mother," Catherine replied, her voice tinged with impatience. "I've moved on. Surely Khaled has too." As the voices faded, Lea caught a glimpse of Catherine. Elegant, poised, every inch the picture of privilege. "Well," Lea said softly, breaking the silence. That was dramatic. Khaled stepped back, straightening his tie. "I didn't expect them to be here today." "Clearly." She smoothed her dress. "Want to tell me what she meant by your ridiculous suspicions?" His expression hardened. "Not here." "Then where, Khaled?" Frustration colored her voice. "You can't keep shutting me out, especially not with the gala coming up. I need to know what I'm walking into." He studied her for a long moment, the internal conflict visible in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Tonight, after dinner?" Later that evening, Lea found Khaled in his study, his jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, and a half-empty glass of scotch beside him. "There's dinner in the warming drawer," he said, without looking up. "I'm not hungry," Lea replied, closing his laptop gently. "Talk to me." After a long pause, Khaled reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a worn leather journal. "This was Adrian's," he said quietly, handing it to her. Lea read the marked page carefully, her eyes widening. Adrian had detailed suspicious transfers involving Richardson Industries, falsified clinical trial data, and a chilling final note. "C says she'll help expose everything. Meeting at the lake house this weekend to plan next steps." He was investigating Richardson's pharmaceutical division, Khaled explained, his voice tight. Catherine initially agreed to help him, but something changed. The night he died, she made 3 calls to her father. After the accident, all the evidence disappeared. "Did you go to the authorities? With what proof? A few cryptic journal entries?" By then, My father had already merged our pharmaceutical divisions. The deal was worth billions. Lea placed a hand on his arm. Is that why you agreed to our arrangement? To maintain appearances? He turned to her, his pain raw and unguarded. I agreed because you were different, honest, real. You didn't want this life, but you were willing to enter it to save someone you loved. Just like Adrian. For a moment, Khaled cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing her lip. But I can't protect you if I let myself feel, he whispered. I don't need protection, she said softly. I need you to trust me. For an instant, his walls crumbled, but then his phone buzzed. The moment shattered, Khaled stepped back, the mask returning. The Richardsons have RSVP'd. All of them. Lea squared her shoulders. Then we'll face them together. Khaled hesitated, his voice low. Whatever happens at the gala, remember, not everything is as it seems. After he left, Lea stared at Adrian's journal, the words echoing in her mind. She had entered this marriage believing she understood the rules. Maintain appearances, keep her heart safe. But now, with so many secrets threatening to surface, everything was about to change. The night of the gala arrived, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and unresolved wounds. Lea stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the midnight blue gown that Khaled's stylist had selected for her. The dress hugged her curves perfectly, its dramatic train pooling behind her, while the deep hue made her skin glow under the soft lighting. You look stunning, Khaled's voice came from the doorway. She turned to see him standing there, every inch the powerful CEO in his tailored tuxedo. But there was something different in the way he looked at her, a depth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Thank you, Lea replied, her tone soft as she studied him. Are you ready for this? I've been ready for 12 years, Khaled said, crossing the room to stand behind her. Their eyes met in the mirror as he fastened a diamond necklace around her throat. His fingers lingered briefly on her skin. But I need to know if you are. For what exactly? She asked, her voice low. For what might happen tonight, he said, his voice carrying an intimate weight. Things could get complicated. Lea turned to face him, catching the faint scent of his cologne. You still won't tell me what you're planning? It's safer if you don't know, he replied, adjusting the necklace with a touch that sent shivers down her spine. Just follow my lead and remember, nothing is as it appears. The Metropolitan Museum's Great Hall had been transformed into a dazzling wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the elegant table settings, while carefully placed spotlights highlighted the grand architecture. The effect was breathtaking, the culmination of weeks of meticulous planning. As Khaled and Lea descended the grand staircase, all eyes turned toward them. They played their roles flawlessly, the commanding CEO and his poised, glamorous wife. But Lea felt the tension in Khaled's hand at her waist, a subtle sign that the evening held more than just glitz and glamour. Khaled, darling. A voice, smooth and saccharine, cut through the crowd. Catherine Richardson approached with practiced grace, her husband Michael trailing dutifully behind. It's been far too long. Lea felt Khaled's fingers tighten briefly on her hip before he turned to greet the couple. Catherine, Michael, thank you for coming. As if we'd miss it, Catherine said, her smile impeccable, though her eyes glinted with something sharp. And this must be your new bride. We were all so surprised when we heard the news. Lea, she said warmly, extending her hand. It's lovely to meet you. Your family's support of the hospital's research program has been remarkable? Yes, well, medical research has always been close to our hearts, Catherine replied, her gaze sliding briefly to Khaled. Hasn't it, darling? Before Khaled could respond, Thomas appeared at his elbow. Mr. Al-Fahim, there's a situation that requires your immediate attention. If you'll excuse me, Khaled said smoothly, giving Leah's hand a reassuring squeeze before leaving with Thomas. Lea, perhaps you could tell Catherine about the new treatment protocols we've been funding. Left alone with Catherine and her quiet, watchful husband, Lea held her composure. Catherine's smile didn't falter as she sipped her champagne. New wife, new charity focus, she mused. One might think Khaled is trying to rewrite history. Or perhaps he's trying to create something positive from tragedy, Lea countered, her voice steady but firm. Catherine's expression sharpened slightly. So he's told you about Adrian. I wondered if he would. He told me enough. Did he tell you about his obsession? How he nearly destroyed both our families with his accusations? Catherine stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Did he tell you what really happened that night? About the file he received the day before Adrian died? Or why he didn't come to the lake house that weekend? Catherine, Michael's tone carried a warning, but she ignored him. Lea held her ground. Mrs. Richardson, I understand you've been carrying this pain for a long time, but throwing accusations at a public event won't help anyone. Something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Surprise? Maybe even respect. You're different than I expected, she said, her smile twisting slightly. Less decorative. I'm full of surprises, Lea replied, excusing herself as she spotted her mother arriving with Daniel. The next hour was a blur of introductions and small talk. Lea kept one eye on Khaled, who moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his conversations with board members intense and purposeful. Whatever his plan was, it was clearly in motion. When dinner was served, Lea noticed something odd. The Richardsons were seated at their assigned table, but they weren't alone. Two men in expensive suits had joined them. Men Lea recognized from news coverage of corporate fraud investigations. As if on cue, Khaled appeared at her side. Dance with me, he murmured, leading her to the dance floor just as the orchestra began a waltz. What's happening? She asked as they moved together effortlessly. In about 10 minutes, federal agents will enter this room with warrants for Robert Richardson and several members of his board, Khaled whispered, his voice a mere breath against her ear. 12 years of patience is about to pay off. Leah's heart raced. The evidence from Adrian's investigation, it wasn't lost? It was preserved, Khaled admitted, and supplemented over the years. Adrian wasn't the only one investigating Richardson Industries. He was just the one they discovered. You've been building this case all this time, Lea realized, her voice barely audible. Khaled nodded. Adrian sent me a file the day before he died. It was proof that Richardson's people had discovered his investigation. I stayed away from the lake house that weekend because I was meeting with federal agents, trying to protect him. I just wasn't fast enough. It wasn't your fault, Lea said, her throat tightening at the raw pain in his voice. No, he said softly. It was theirs. And tonight, they'll finally face the consequences. As if on cue, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Men in dark suits entered the hall, their jackets emblazoned with FBI logos. The elegant atmosphere dissolved into chaos as Robert Richardson was led away in handcuffs, his wife sobbing theatrically while Catherine stood frozen, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers to shatter on the marble floor. Through it all, Khaled held Lea close, their waltz unbroken as though the chaos around them didn't exist. Why didn't you tell me? Lea asked finally. I needed your reactions to be genuine, Khaled said. The Richardsons have been watching us, looking for any sign of what was coming. You were perfect, exactly what they expected to see. The beautiful, naive wife, too new to know about old scandals. I'm not naive, she said, her voice steady. No, he agreed, his eyes softening. You're extraordinary. Before she could respond, Thomas appeared once again. Sir, the press is outside. They'll want a statement. Khaled nodded, but didn't release Lea. Tell them we'll be out in 5 minutes. And Thomas, make sure Leah's mother and brother get home safely. As Thomas left, Lea looked up at Khaled. Ready to face the cameras together? Instead of answering, Khaled leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't calculated or part of their performance. It was real, raw, and powerful. The room buzzed with whispers and camera flashes, but Lea felt only Khaled. his lips speaking a truth they'd both avoided for too long. When he pulled back, his eyes held a mix of triumph and vulnerability. "Together," he said. As they walked toward the press conference, Lea realized their carefully constructed arrangement had shattered. In its place was something new and fragile, something neither of them had planned, but both had secretly hoped for. Dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the city in soft pinks and golds. Lea stood at the penthouse windows, still wearing her gown from the gala. The past 12 hours felt surreal. Arrests, a press conference, and endless questions from reporters, eager to connect the dots between Adrian's death and Richardson's downfall. "You should get some rest," Khaled said softly from behind her. Lea turned, realizing with certainty that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, a new fight, and perhaps a new kind of partnership. Khaled's voice interrupted Leah's thoughts as she gazed out at the skyline, lost in the chaos of her mind. He stood in the doorway, his bow tie undone and his sleeves rolled up, a far cry from his usual perfect appearance. The slight dishevelment made him seem more human, more approachable. "I'm not sure I could sleep," she admitted, turning to face him. "My mind keeps racing." The look on Catherine's face when they arrested her father, she knew. Khaled moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Maybe not everything, but she knew enough. The investigators found emails proving she warned her father about Adrian's investigation. Lea studied his profile in the early morning light, noting the weariness etched into his features. "How do you feel, after all these years of waiting, of planning?" "Hollow," he answered, surprising them both with his honesty. "I thought bringing them to justice would feel different, more satisfying, more complete." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of vulnerability. "But it doesn't bring Adrian back. It doesn't change the fact that I failed to protect him." Without thinking, Lea reached for his hand. "You didn't fail him, Khaled. You spent 12 years making sure his death wasn't in vain." His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and steady. He turned to her, their joined hands a silent connection between them. "The hospital board is meeting this afternoon to discuss contingency plans. Richardson's arrest will impact the research funding." "We'll find other donors," Lea said with quiet determination. "My mother's case proves the treatment works. We can use that to attract new supporters." "We," Khaled repeated softly, his eyes searching hers. "Yes, we," she said firmly. "Unless you're planning to maintain professional distance now that the Richardson threat is neutralized." Something shifted in his expression. Fear, hope, or maybe both. "Would you want that? To go back to our original arrangement?" "Would you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering, Khaled reached up with his free hand to cup her cheek. "I think we both know our arrangement stopped being purely professional weeks ago." "When?" she asked, leaning slightly into his touch. "When did it change for you?" "That first morning in the Hamptons," he admitted. "When you asked me what I wanted from life. No one had asked me that in years." His thumb brushed her cheek gently, sending a shiver through her. "And for me," she began softly, "it was when you showed me Adrian's journal. You trusted me with your pain, your vulnerability. That's when I realized you were more than the mask you wear." Their faces drew closer, the magnetic pull between them almost impossible to resist. Just as Khaled leaned in, his phone buzzed insistently. He sighed, glancing at the message. "The board," he said. "They've moved the meeting up. They're waiting for us." "Us?" Lea asked, stepping back slightly. "You're my wife," he said simply. "And after last night's events, they'll expect us to present a united front." Lea smoothed the rumpled fabric of her gown. "I should change. I doubt last night's evening wear is appropriate for a morning board meeting." As she turned to leave, Khaled caught her arm. "Lea, we need to talk about this, about us, about what happens next." She offered him a small smile. "I know, but right now, we have a hospital to save and a legacy to protect. The rest can wait." Khaled nodded, understanding in his eyes. Thomas will bring the files to your room. Take 30 minutes to change and review them. The board meeting was intense, but productive. Lea sat beside Khaled as he outlined plans to stabilize the hospital's funding. Her occasional input demonstrated their synchronicity as a team, and the board members, initially skeptical of her presence, gradually deferred to her judgment on matters related to the research program. As they left the hospital, Lea noticed something was wrong. Khaled's confident stride had slowed, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. "Are you all right?" she asked, touching his arm. "Just tired," he assured her, though his voice sounded strained. "It's been a long 24 hours. Before she could respond, he stumbled slightly, catching himself against the wall. His face had gone alarmingly pale. "Khaled," Lea said urgently, moving to support him. She felt the heat radiating from his body. "You're burning up." "I'm fine," he insisted weakly, but his legs gave way before he could finish the sentence. Lea barely managed to break his fall, shouting for help as hospital staff rushed to assist. Within minutes, Khaled was being wheeled into the emergency department. Severe exhaustion and dehydration, the doctor explained later, combined with what appears to be a nasty case of the flu. "Has he been under unusual stress lately?" Lea almost laughed. "You could say that." "He needs rest, real rest," the doctor said firmly. "Not just a few hours between meetings. I'm prescribing at least 3 days of home recovery. No work, no phones, no stress." Sitting beside Khaled's hospital bed, Lea watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. Her protective instincts flared. He had spent years taking care of everyone else. His father's company, Adrian's memory, her family's needs. Now it was her turn to take care of him. When his eyes finally fluttered open, they focused immediately on her face. "The board meeting." "It's handled," she interrupted firmly. "Thomas rescheduled everything for next week. Right now, you're under strict orders to rest." "I don't have time to rest," he protested weakly. "The press will be watching, waiting for signs of weakness." "Let them watch," Lea said, taking his hand. His fingers automatically intertwined with hers. "They'll see exactly what we want them to see. A devoted wife taking care of her husband after he orchestrated one of the biggest corporate fraud exposures in history. It's perfect for our image." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Still thinking about appearances?" "No," she said softly. "I'm thinking about the man I'm falling in love with and how I'm not ready to lose him to his own stubborn pride." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Khaled's eyes widened slightly, his hand tightening on hers. "Lea," he began, his voice rough with emotion. She placed a finger against his lips. "Rest first," she insisted gently. "We'll talk about everything else when you're stronger." 3 days later, the morning sun filtered through the penthouse windows as Lea prepared a breakfast tray. Khaled had grown restless, but his body was still recovering. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in silk pajama pants and a t-shirt, he looked impossibly handsome, despite his lingering pallor. "If you're planning to force-feed me more soup, I might have to file for divorce," he teased. "Back to bed," Lea ordered, trying to ignore how the casual attire made him seem more accessible, more real. "I've been in bed for 3 days," he said, moving to the kitchen island and sitting carefully. "I need to check on the Richardson situation." "The press has been handled," Lea interrupted, sliding a cup of ginger tea toward him. "Thomas and I have been managing everything. The story is exactly what we want it to be." Khaled wrapped his hands around the warm cup, studying her. "You've been remarkable through all of this." "I'm just fulfilling our arrangement," she said lightly, though they both knew that wasn't true anymore. "About that," he said, setting the cup down. His eyes were serious. "What you said at the hospital—" Leah's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped he might forget her declaration of love in his fever-induced haze. "You were sick," she said quickly. "I would have said anything to make you rest." "Liar," Khaled said softly, his voice almost tender. "You've never been good at lying." Before Lea could respond, the elevator chimed, and her mother appeared, Daniel pushing her wheelchair. The interruption gave her a reprieve, but she knew the conversation wasn't over. Later, as Lea and Khaled stood alone in the kitchen, he broke the silence. "Your mother is remarkable." "She is," Lea agreed. "She thinks we're in love." Khaled's breath caught audibly. "And what do you think?" Lea moved closer, her heart pounding. "I think I'm tired of pretending, of maintaining appearances, of acting." Khaled stepped toward her, his eyes locked on hers. "Then let's stop pretending." Lea stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. "I think I'm tired of pretending," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Tired of maintaining appearances. Tired of acting like I don't feel what I feel." Khaled closed the distance between them, his eyes searching hers. "And what do you feel?" "You know what I feel," she whispered, emotion breaking through her voice. "I told you in the hospital." His hands came up to frame her face, gentle yet trembling slightly. "Tell me again, please." Lea looked deep into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability he so often kept hidden. "I'm falling in love with you, Khaled." "Actually, no," she corrected herself, taking a deep breath. "I've already fallen. Completely. Terrifyingly. I'm in love with you." For a moment, he just stared at her, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. Then, slowly and deliberately, he leaned down and kissed her. Unlike the calculated kiss they had shared at the gala, this one was soft, tender, filled with all the words they hadn't yet spoken. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, his voice raw with emotion. "I love you," he whispered. "I've been fighting it, trying to protect you, to protect myself. But I can't fight it anymore. I love you, Lea." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she smiled. "So, what do we do now?" "Now," he said, pulling her closer. "We tear up that contract and start over. No arrangements, no appearances to maintain, just us, building something real." "Together," she agreed. As they stood in the kitchen, wrapped in each other's arms, Lea realized that sometimes the most beautiful things in life came from the most unexpected beginnings. Their arrangement had started as a business deal, but it had transformed into something far more precious. A love story written in their own way. The September morning was crisp and bright as Lea sat in her doctor's waiting room, nervously twisting the wedding ring on her finger. It was no longer a symbol of a business arrangement, but of the love she now shared with Khaled. For weeks, she had been feeling off, dizzy spells, fatigue, and a sudden aversion to her favorite coffee. "Mrs. Al-Fahim," the nurse called, leading her into an examination room. 20 minutes later, Lea sat in shock as Dr. Chen repeated the news. "You're pregnant," the doctor said with a warm smile. "About 8 weeks along, and based on the ultrasound, congratulations, you're having twins." "Twins," Lea repeated, the word echoing in her mind as she left the building. Her hand instinctively moved to her still flat stomach. She and Khaled hadn't even discussed children yet. Their relationship had only recently become real. How would he react to this unexpected news? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Khaled. "Meeting finished early. Join me for lunch?" Their usual cafe was quiet when Lea arrived. Khaled stood to greet her, pulling her close for a kiss that still made her heart race. The past 2 months of their real relationship had softened his demeanor, though he remained as commanding as ever in public. "You look pale," he observed as they sat. "Are you feeling all right?" Lea took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for his across the table. "We need to talk." Concern immediately shadowed his expression. "What's wrong? Is it your mother's treatment?" "No," Lea said quickly. "Mom's doing great. The latest scans show she's almost in complete remission." She hesitated, squeezing his hand. "This is about us, about our future." "You're scaring me," he said softly. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "With twins." For a moment, Khaled sat completely still, his expression unreadable. The silence between them felt heavy, and Leah's heart pounded as she waited for his reaction. "Please say something," she whispered. He blinked as if snapping out of a trance. "Twins," he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," Lea said, her voice barely audible. "I just found out. I know we haven't discussed children, and this wasn't planned, but—" "Marry me," Khaled interrupted. Lea frowned. "We're already married." "No," he said, moving his chair closer and taking both her hands in his. "Marry me for real. Not because of a contract or business arrangements. Marry me because I love you. Because we're having twins. Because I want to spend the rest of my life building a family with you." His eyes held hers, filled with raw emotion. "Let's have a real wedding. Small, intimate, just family and close friends. No press, no business obligations. Just us, making real vows based on love." Tears spilled down Leah's cheeks as she nodded. "You really want this? The babies? A new wedding? All of it?" "More than I've ever wanted anything," Khaled said, reaching up to wipe her tears. "You've given me back my heart, Lea, and now you're giving me a family I never thought I could have." Their moment was interrupted by Khaled's phone, buzzing insistently. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. "It's my father," he said. "He's flying in from Dubai tonight. He wants to discuss urgent family matters." Leah's heart sank. Abdul Al-Fahim was a traditionalist who had only approved their marriage for its business advantage. How would he react to the news that their marriage had become real, and to the twins? "He'll be part of their lives," Khaled said firmly, reading her thoughts. "But he needs to accept that our marriage is real now, that we're building a family." "And if he doesn't?" Lea asked hesitantly. "Then that's his loss," Khaled said, his voice resolute. "I've spent my whole life trying to meet his expectations, to be the perfect son after Adrian's death. But I won't sacrifice my happiness, or our happiness, anymore." That evening, they waited in Khaled's office at Al-Fahim Tower for Abdul's arrival. Lea wore a conservative dress that didn't hint at her condition, while Khaled paced near the windows, tension evident in his every movement. When Abdul entered, his presence commanded the room. He was sharp and unyielding, a man who had shaped Khaled's sense of duty. "Father," Khaled greeted him formally. "Welcome back to New York." "Save the pleasantries," Abdul said briskly, his accent heavy. "We need to discuss the Richardson situation. The board is concerned about the publicity." "The board approved my handling of the situation," Khaled replied evenly. "The press has been positive, and our stock price has actually increased. They approved because they had no choice. But there are questions about your judgment," Abdul said, his sharp gaze shifting to Lea. "About your priorities." "My priorities are exactly where they should be," Khaled said, moving to stand beside Lea. He took her hand, his voice steady. "With my family." Abdul's eyes narrowed. This arrangement was meant to stabilize the company's image. Nothing more. "Things have changed," Khaled said. "We've changed. We're in love," Lea added quietly. "And we're having twins." The silence that followed was deafening. Abdul's expression darkened, his voice harsh. "This is unacceptable. A romantic entanglement will complicate everything. And children. Now, when the company needs your full attention?" "The company has my attention," Khaled said, his tone like steel. "But it no longer has my soul. I lost Adrian because I put business before family. I won't make that mistake again." "You dare mention Adrian?" Abdul's face flushed with anger. "After you failed to protect him?" "No, father. You failed to protect him," Khaled said, his grip on Leah's hand tightening. "You chose business deals over justice and made me do the same. But not anymore. Lea and our children come first." Abdul turned to Lea, his gaze cold. "Do you think you can give him what he needs? An understanding of our world? Our obligations?" Lea met his gaze steadily. "I think I already have. I've given him permission to be himself, to feel, to love. And soon, I'll give him children who will know their father as a man of heart, not just duty." Something flickered in Abdul's expression. Surprise, perhaps even reluctant respect. He looked between them, seeing their united front, the protective way Khaled angled his body toward Lea. "You really love her?" he asked his son softly. "More than life," Khaled said without hesitation. For the first time, Abdul's sharp demeanor softened. "Your mother would have liked her," he said quietly. "She always said you needed someone strong enough to challenge you, brave enough to love you completely." Tears shone in Khaled's eyes at the mention of his mother. "You never talk about her." "Perhaps that was my mistake," Abdul admitted. "One of many." He turned to Lea, his voice gentler. "The twins will need their grandfather." "They will," Lea said, a small smile on her lips. "And so will we." Later that night, as Khaled rested his hand over her slightly rounded stomach, Lea reflected on how far they had come. Their carefully arranged marriage had turned into something neither of them had planned. Something real, strong, and filled with hope for the future. Lea smiled softly as Khaled shared a story about Adrian. "He always had a way of making life less serious," Khaled said, his voice tinged with both nostalgia and warmth. "Once, during finals week, Adrian kidnapped me for an impromptu trip to Atlantic City. He decided I needed to remember how to laugh." Lea chuckled, leaning into his embrace. "Did you?" "We lost $200 at blackjack," Khaled admitted, grinning. "Ate terrible casino buffet food and drove back singing karaoke so badly it could have cracked the car windows." "And you still aced your finals, didn't you?" Lea teased gently. "I did," Khaled said with a laugh. "And Adrian never let me forget that sometimes the best moments in life are the unplanned ones." Lea tilted her head up to meet his gaze. "Like falling in love with your contract wife?" He turned in her arms, his expression tender. "Exactly like that." His hand drifted to her growing belly, resting there with a mixture of awe and protectiveness. "Or finding out we're having twins." "Are you nervous about Sunday?" she asked, referring to their second wedding, this time for love. "About marrying the woman I love, who's carrying my children, in front of the people who mean the most to us?" He pretended to think. "Terrified." Lea laughed, swatting his chest. "Be serious." "I am," he said, framing her face with his hands. "I'm terrified of how much I love you, of how complete you've made my life. Sometimes I wake up afraid it's all been a dream." "It's not a dream," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "It's just a different kind of arrangement than we planned." Speaking of arrangements, Khaled suddenly looked nervous. "There's something I want to show you." He led her to his study, where a thick envelope lay on his desk. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it," he said. Inside, she found their original marriage contract, torn neatly in half. Beneath it was another document, a deed to the brownstone, listed in both their names. "I know it's not very romantic," Khaled said quickly, watching her reaction. "But I wanted you to see that everything I have, everything I am, is yours now. No contracts, no conditions." Tears spilled down Leah's cheeks as she launched herself into his arms. "I love you, you impossible man." "Even when I'm terribly corporate about romance?" he teased. "Especially then," she replied, smiling through her tears. "Because that's who you are, the perfect blend of businessman and loving husband. And soon, a loving father." As if on cue, she felt a flutter in her belly, the first definitive movement of their babies. Khaled's eyes widened as she guided his hand to the spot. "Was that your daughter saying hello?" she teased. "Or sons," he countered with a grin. "Or one of each." He pulled her closer, his voice thick with emotion. 3 more days until I can marry you properly." "We're already married," she reminded him, her voice light. "No," he said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We were contracted. Now we're choosing each other, every day, for love." As they stood in his study, feeling the life growing beneath their joined hands, Lea marveled at how life's greatest gifts often came disguised as business arrangements. The October sunset bathed the Hamptons in warm hues of gold and rose, as Lea stood before the full-length mirror in what would soon be their new bedroom. Her wedding dress, designed to accommodate her growing belly, floated around her in layers of ivory silk. "You look beautiful," her mother said softly, adjusting the veil. Claire's eyes shone with happy tears, her face glowing with health that had once seemed impossible. "We're already married," Lea said with a small laugh, smoothing the fabric over her stomach. The twins had been particularly active all day. This is everything," Claire interrupted gently. "This is love, chosen freely and given completely." A knock at the door revealed Daniel in his best suit. "They're ready downstairs," he said, "and Khaled is about to wear a hole in the garden path." The intimate gathering waited in the estate's rose garden, with only 30 guests, family and closest friends who had supported their journey from arrangement to love. As Lea descended the terrace steps on Daniel's arm, her eyes found Khaled immediately. He stood beneath an arch of white roses, more handsome than ever in his tuxedo. But it was his expression that stole her breath. Pure love and wonder, as though he were seeing her for the first time. Abdul stood beside his son, his usually stern demeanor softened by emotion. Barbara Maxwell dabbed at her eyes, while Thomas beamed from his seat among the guests. Even Khaled's board members, once skeptical of their marriage, seemed moved by the obvious love between the couple. When Lea reached Khaled, he took her hands in his thumbs brushing her knuckles in that familiar, comforting gesture she adored. The officiant began, "Dearly beloved," but Lea barely heard the words. She was lost in Khaled's eyes, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. When it was time for their vows, Khaled spoke first, his voice strong despite the emotion in his face. "Lea, I once offered you a contract, thinking I could control love like I controlled everything else in my life. But you taught me that real love can't be contained in clauses and conditions. You brought light back into my world, helped me remember how to feel, how to trust, how to live fully." He placed a hand on her belly, drawing smiles and gasps from the guests. "You've given me a family, not just our children, but a reason to open my heart again. I promise to love you without conditions, to cherish every moment we create together, and to always remember that the best things in life are the ones we don't plan for." Tears streamed down Leah's cheeks as she began her vows. "Khaled, I came to you seeking security, thinking I could keep my heart safe behind walls of practicality. But you showed me that true security comes from being brave enough to love completely. You've given me so much more than I ever dreamed. Hope, joy, partnership, and a love that grows stronger every day. I promise to stand beside you, to face whatever comes together, and to remind you every day that you are worthy of all the love in the world." As they exchanged new rings, chosen together, Lea noticed Abdul wiping away tears. He caught her looking and offered her a warm smile, so different from the stern man she had first met. "I now pronounce you husband and wife, again," the officiant said, drawing laughter from the guests. "You may kiss your bride." Khaled drew her close, one hand cradling her face, while the other rested protectively over their children. This kiss was different. No performance, no calculation, just pure, honest love. The small reception was filled with joy and laughter. Claire danced with Abdul, surprising everyone with his grace, while Daniel gave a heartfelt toast about watching his sister find love in the most unexpected place. Even Barbara Maxwell dropped her polished persona to share stories of witnessing their love unfold. Later, under the stars, Khaled wrapped his arms around Lea from behind. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning into him as their hands rested over the twins. "Your daughters seem to be celebrating," she teased. "Or sons," he corrected with a grin. "Either way, they're already making their presence known." Khaled turned her in his arms, his expression serious. "I have something for you." He handed her an envelope. Inside was the deed to a foundation, the Adrian Al-Fahim Memorial Research Fund. The board approved it this morning, he explained. All proceeds from the Richardson settlement, plus matching funds from Alpha-Heme Industries. It will support cancer research and corporate ethics investigations. Khaled, Lea breathed, her voice trembling. It's perfect. It honors Adrian, my mother, and everything we've fought for. And someday, Khaled added, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, we'll tell our children about their uncle who helped make it possible. And their father, Lea said, her voice steady, who chose love over appearances, truth over convenience. And their mother, Khaled whispered, pulling her close, who taught me how to believe in love again. As if in agreement, the twins stirred, making Lea laugh. They seemed to approve. Of course they do, Khaled said with a smile. They're part of this love story, after all. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Lea thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first meeting in his office to this moment, they had turned a cold business arrangement into something real, something beautiful. What are you thinking about? Khaled murmured. How sometimes the best contracts are the ones we break, Lea replied with a smile, and how love doesn't need conditions to flourish. No conditions, Khaled agreed, kissing her softly. Just us, our family, and all the wonderful unplanned moments ahead. Lea drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, dreaming of their future, a life built on the strongest foundation of all, love.